it's not a trade in any kind of sense that the NFL or the NBA might recognize, which is a formalized process. This is an informalized process that we're just pasting the word trade on top of. A bit of, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. But there it is. Demetrious Johnson appears to be headed to ONE, and Ben Askren appears to be headed to the UFC. My initial read based on Twitter was that some people were in favor of it. A lot of my MMA colleagues are not. A lot of my MMA colleagues don't like this. I'm going to tell you right up front, I do. Now, with a couple of caveats, which I'll get to in a second, but your overall, King of Banter, your initial assessment, when I just give you those details, when I read that to you, and of course you've had a few minutes to ponder it as well, your reaction is a good one, your reaction is a bad one. Which is it? I really like it. It's a good one. Okay, tell me what your reasoning is for liking it, because I don't know if you've seen on Twitter, and again, I don't want to make every goddamn... MMA media, and I am guilty of this. Way guilty of this. We overestimate the value and role Twitter plays, and we amplify its voices way more than we should. But okay, fair to say in an informal poll of my MMA media colleagues, they don't like this, but you seem to. Why? I just think it actually makes sense. You got Ben Askren over at ONE doing nothing, who's essentially retired because he doesn't feel like fighting for him anymore. We get him to the UFC and see how he really, truly will stack up against some of the welterweight bests in the world. And look, I love DJ. I do. I love watching him fight. I like learning from stuff that he does. But the truth is, like, the people just don't respond to him. He doesn't have the belt now. This is like a classic. It feels like a classic NFL trade move of like, okay, let's unload them now while we can, type of deal. Mm-hmm. And listen, I'm sure he'll make a lot of money over at ONE. I don't know how much the demand will be there for him, but like, yeah, it just seems like it's a good money-making opportunity for him. I think it works out for all parties involved. I actually like it. I'm sorry to see DJ go, but the flyweight division just isn't doing anything here. I would say I more or less agree with that. Now, there's a lot of different ways we're going to slice and dice this. So we're going to have a big, big show today. We're going to get into other fantasy trades you'd like to see. We're using the word trade here in a very informal sense. Who Ben Askren might fight in the UFC, because remember, his best buddy, Tyron Woodley, is the champion in that very weight class. So that's kind of interesting. Does the trade make sense for the parties involved? Is another question that we have to wrestle with. Why is this happening? What are the mechanics that make it happen? Let me back up a step before we get into all of that, because we have so much to get into. Plus, by the way, your phone calls at 877-FIGHT-93, 877-344-4893. But I asked you, King of Banter, if this was something you liked. You said yes. I told you that I liked it as well, with a couple of caveats, and I do. To your point, let me actually start with those caveats. If you know that I'm in favor of this, what might those caveats be? Look, in a perfect world, you would never want to get rid of that 125-pound division, right? In a perfect world, that you would never, ever want to do that. You would want to be in a position where you could keep all that, the weight class. Hell, you could open up atom weight for the women as well, right? There's a lot of different things you could do. And Demetrious Johnson certainly lost his belt recently, but we're talking about an all-time great. Right? I mean, losing him while he is still in his relative prime, I mean, these are never by themselves good things. It's not a good thing. It's not a good thing by itself. So I don't like that so much. And I worry about some of the mechanics that make this deal not even possible, but probable at this point. Namely, we are entering a new era, but it feels like an old era. It used to be the case when I covered MMA that the UFC and or Pride, depending on how far back you want to go, had the majority of the best talent in the world. So let's just say post-Pride's destruction, the UFC had the most talent in the world. But there were a number of MMA organizations out there that had world-class fighters in them. Some had a bunch. Some just had a couple. Some maybe just had one. But they were at least dispersed a little bit everywhere. And what happened was the UFC took over and hit an absolute monstrous growth period. And when they did that, pay-per-view buy rates were through the roof. They could hold pay-per-views in Abu Dhabi, air them in the afternoon on the East Coast time, and they would still do more than 500,000 buys. They can't hardly find anyone outside of Conor or Nate to do that at this point. Right? Very, very difficult to do that. They used to be able to do that easily. Television ratings were through the roof, and fan enthusiasm was high. Dana White had a lot of control. The UFC was just a hot property. Everything was going their direction. And look, the guys who were running that organization were also fight fans. and they wanted to consolidate all the best talent. Look, if we're going to not merely be a business, but we're going to be stewards of the sport, we're going to have to do this something relative to the right way. In any case, the launch of the flyweight division got launched quite inauspiciously with the UFC. But they made it work. So they had the best flyweight division in the world. They had the best bantamweight, featherweight, lightweight, welterweight, middleweight, light heavy, and heavy. They never really did the super heavy thing, although some other organizations experimented with that. And they really had consolidated most of the best talent. Remember, they eventually scooped up Strikeforce. And it was just like, what is another organization going to do to really compete with this? Bellator tried some interesting things under Bjorn Rebney. They developed their own guys. They found some other ones. And they were able to sign a couple here or there. But you get the idea, like, and it still is true that the UFC has the overwhelming majority of the best talent in the world. But it feels like, because I'm not quite sure this is correct, but it feels like this is the first time in a long time where you have a number of other organizations outside of the UFC, and a lot of them have some world-class talent. You know, one won't just have Eddie and Demetrious. Bibiano Fernandez has spent a big portion of his career there as well, and God only knows who else they might groom. All right, so I mentioned that there was a caveat I didn't like, but here's the greater mechanics. That brought you to that consolidation period. But folks, the largest portion of the MMA audience is the casual fan. And here's the truth. If the UFC wanted to ride this out and find a way to make flyweight work, I think they could. They could find somebody who was really capable of taking that division to the next level. I believe, and I've said this before, I believe it's kind of like swimming against the current. The general preference of the MMA fan trends, let's say, right to left. The most adept swimmer could still make it to shore going through the current, and that would be fine. But the reality is that's just not the general preference. And I do think if they waited it out, they could find that kind of right person, and you could get something out of it. And maybe Henry Cejudo with the belt will make that work, although the future of the flyweight division is now imperiled. Something else we'll discuss here as well. But this is my point. Pay-per-views are bottoming out. Ratings are bottoming out. Combat sports generally are moving towards streaming. This is a change and a transition period. And I don't love that they're putting a premium on fighters who can sell versus fighters who are good, insofar as you can make that distinction with Demetrious Johnson, if not necessarily the rest of the flyweight division. But the UFC, I think, probably to some extent still sees themselves as the stewards of the sport. But when business declines, and I know what they're saying about last year, there was the biggest year in money making, but we all know the reality about what's happening with the business. They need to make some different choices for themselves. This might mean, by the way, that the 165-pound division gets opened up, which I think is more fertile existing territory for them to make money. Frankly, it's one that we've discussed ad nauseum on this show. My only point being is when business was good, it provided them the latitude to make some choices about what kinds of offerings as a product they could make. And when the business declined, they had to make some tougher choices. Now, I don't know that they're going to close flyweight, but it's just hard to see when you lose Demetrious Johnson, and now you have the next fight for the champion likely being at 135 pounds, what you're going to do with the Juicier Formigas and Sergio Pettis. By the way, Sergio Pettis bumping back up to 135. Right? What are you going to do with these guys? You're just going to keep them around? The largest portion of the MMA fan base, which is the casual fan, has made themselves, at least for now, pretty clear. They don't really care about having a super complete organization that works as a steward of the sport. They care about big names, big personalities. They care about recognizable figures. They care about weight classes that seem interesting to them. And maybe their palate sucks. Hint, it does. If you're a good fight fan, flyweight is and will always remain a great division to watch contests. And by the way, Demetrious Johnson's not really going anywhere in terms of quitting. He's just moving to a different organization. He'll still be fighting, and King of Banter, no one's talking about this, he's going to be fighting in an organization where he can knee a grounded opponent. So, yes, please. That sounds great, actually.
I forgot all about that.
Right. So, it's not a like-for-like trade here. There's a bit of an upgrade possibility as well for him. But we'll get to that down the road. Here's my only point. Business contracted. It contracted. And you can say this is not a smart long-term play. I'm not even sure I can really argue with that. But it might be a good short-term play. And people could say, well, what about Ben Askren? Is this the smartest call for him? Why are they banking on him? I agree. In a modern context, a super, very, very modern context, he hasn't really fought the best. But boy, those easy wins over Andrei Koreshkov and that dominant win over Douglas Lima, they have aged well. He has not taken hardly any damage. He's got a big mouth and a big personality, and there's at least some potential. And if he bottoms out and it's not a big success, to me, it was a bit of a low-risk kind of situation for them. Right? High reward, low risk, quite frankly. And it's in that sweet spot of MMA at 155, 170 where they can do a lot with it. So why is this happening? It's happening because the UFC has had to make, it seems like, some tougher choices about what their product can offer, because it used to be that they could just give you kind of whatever and people took it. And we are so far past that they have to make some tougher choices, it appears, even when it comes at the expense of the quality, potentially anyway, of the product. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel. There's other videos you can watch right here. If you've never heard my SiriusXM radio show, there's a link in the description box below. You can try it for free for 30 days. The Luke Thomas Show airs weekdays, 3 to 6 p.m. Eastern on SiriusXM Fight Nation, Channel 93. Catch y'all next time.